Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Wednesday, August 4th, 2021. And today I'm going to try to answer one of the most common questions we get overall. And with sanctuaries now being used as a term way more often outside of just immigration, I want to try to do my best to answer the question of, well, what exactly is a sanctuary city, or what is a sanctuary state? What qualifies? What makes it that? Is it just because they say they are, or is there something that they're doing? It's actually not a legal definition. It really is a political definition. So on this episode, I've got that definition. I've got political or discussions on this from three different categories: two from mainstream media, two from supporters, and two from opponents. And even though they frame the overall discussion differently, they really come to the same end result. And so I also am going to cover where this comes from in the constitutional structure, the tradition, and how the courts have addressed these types of policies over the years. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out. There you're going to find all the archives of the show for over 3 years. On individual episodes like this one today, I'm going to link to all the stuff that I referenced so you can read it in full context on your own time in case you want to do more learning, because I'm really just scratching the surface. You can also find all of our different platforms. We live stream primarily on mainstream ones like YouTube and Facebook. We're on Twitter and Twitch, but we also live stream on Odyssey.com. We have archive videos over at Gab TV, Minds.com, MeWe, Brighteon, BitChute, Hyper, all over the place. And then we have an audio-only podcast edition, which is on all the usual suspects: Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, Podbean, and the rest. You can find that and even our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. All that and more over at the show homepage, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, it's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. A quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. I appreciate you spending some time with me today. I apologize if I don't get to everyone, but hello to Clay, Kent, and Funky Euphemism, Joe, Josh for Liberty. Haven't seen you in a while, Josh. Good to see you, buddy. Dwayne, Patricia Dance, Senator DT, Dan Reed, and everyone else. Let's just get right to it. And I want to start out with this definition from Reuters. Now, most of the definitions I'm going to be talking about come from immigration, because this is where we've heard of sanctuary cities or sanctuary states now for many decades. And it actually goes back to the 1980s where we're talking about sanctuaries and immigration. And here from Reuters, they put it this way: the sanctuary, I like how they put it in quotes, the sanctuary movement dates back to the 1980s when U.S. churches sheltered Central American migrants who had fled civil strife in the region and feared deportation. Now, this is of course, there's been sanctuaries in times of war and people escaping things all through history in all kinds of countries around the world. Some people say, oh, the Fugitive Slave Act resistance or the Underground Railroad was kind of a sanctuary movement. But we're talking about the modern usage of the term, and it really started popping up again in the 1980s. Reuters is correct there. They say the label is now generally applied to states and localities. Now, this is the more broad thing, and being mainstream media, they're going to talk about the stuff that most everybody else is talking about. They say it's generally applied to states and localities that have laws, policies, or regulations that make it harder for Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, ICE, to track down and arrest immigrants they believe are deportable. The reason that it's more difficult is because those policies, what they're doing is they're saying, we're not going to help you. We're going to stop participating in your enforcement. However, they say there is no official definition of a sanctuary, and levels of cooperation vary from place to place. It can be very narrow. Some in the immigration world, some of them don't participate in the 287G program. Some of them don't do detainer requests from the DHS, the requests. Some of them don't participate in immigration enforcement in large scopes, and some of them do it in smaller. So it does vary. But generally, what we're seeing is if they're stopping participation in some level of enforcement, they're being termed a sanctuary. Now, on the one side, it's a political term, of course, and I'll get to political terms on this in just a moment. The one side says this is a great thing politically, and the other side says this exact same thing is a terrible thing politically. They also say you can do this or you can't do this based on their personal political preferences. Now, here's one from Emily Van Fossen at the Niskanen Center, and they're definitely on the pro side of immigration sanctuary cities, at least from this her report here in full detail. She puts it this way: cities, counties, and states are designated a sanctuary jurisdiction when they implement any one policy that in some way limits the use of local law enforcement resources, like personnel or facilities, to assist ICE in carrying out federal immigration responsibilities. They say again, sanctuary policies fall on a spectrum, from total noncompliance to promising to help only when resources are available. And generally in those situations, they don't help a lot. And sometimes they're doing it politically. They're pretending they're creating a sanctuary to get the red meat base excited, but then they're not really doing it. We see this on immigration and Second Amendment sanctuaries, politicians grandstanding. But this is, again, the same definition. Here on the anti-side is an organization called Federation for American Immigration Reform, FAIR. They, again, use the same definition. Sanctuary policies are those followed by towns, cities, counties, states, and other jurisdictions that restrict most forms of cooperation with federal immigration authorities. Now, they don't really point out that it does go on a spectrum. They say any sanctuary, again, this is how they turn it into a political definition. They're like, well, if they're a sanctuary, they're just restricting most forms. But if you read through most of these, a lot of them are very, very narrowly tailored. Now, that doesn't mean you have to support or oppose them. It's just that they're doing a kind of a twisted political statement here as well. But they are correct in saying that they're restricting cooperation. Again, same message over and over. Hear from my great friends at the Southern Poverty Law Center, who consider me one of the leaders of the radical right, the 30 leaders to watch in the radical right, which is pretty absurd. They've had a profile up on me for about a decade. They absolutely hate me. This is someone called Naomi Sue over at SPLC, and she actually gets, again, this same definition out there. A sanctuary city has limited the extent to which it will volunteer resources in support of federal immigration enforcement agents' responsibility to enforce federal immigration law. You can see how, because she's a supporter of these, you can see how she's tailored this same message that it's a ban on the use of enforcement or resources to help enforce in a more positive way. She uses terms like volunteer resources, and this is a federal responsibility, so the message comes out the way that she wants people to hear it. And here on the anti-side, of course, Center for Immigration Studies, CIS, does a lot on immigration sanctuaries, and they put it this way. This is from Jessica Vaughn. These cities, counties, and states have laws, ordinances, regulations, resolutions, policies, or other practices that obstruct immigration enforcement. Well, they're obstructing the immigration enforcement on a state or a local level. They aren't really actively obstructing the feds, and shield criminals from ICE, either by refusing to or prohibiting agencies from complying with ICE detainers. That's one of the narrow ones. Imposing unreasonable conditions on detainer acceptance, another one of the more narrow ones. Denying ICE access to interview incarcerated aliens. They're saying, well, you can't use our facilities, you got to take them elsewhere. That's a little broader, a little bit more aggressive. Or otherwise impeding communication or information exchanges between their personnel and federal immigration officers. So they take a very anti-view on this when it comes to immigration sanctuaries. But the general overall definition is the same for all of them. It's saying we're restricting this participation from state and local in various ways, whether it's information sharing or using facilities or helping in enforcement. Here's another mainstream media source, Del Mar, VA now. I don't know, it's probably in the USA Today realm just by the structure of the website. But they point out that experts say sanctuary city isn't actually a legal term. It isn't. It's a political term that has come to mean a jurisdiction that in some way attempts to limit cooperation between state or local officials and federal immigration agencies like the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Now, it's important that they're calling this a political term, and I've already mentioned this a couple of times, because even though the definitions are pretty much the same, as I was pointing out, the way that the discussion is framed really changes from person to person, organization to organization, and from now that we're starting to see it on other issues, we're seeing it framed differently based on what the political issues. And sanctuary, even though it's primarily been used for immigration, I actually think that's a bad thing. I'm not going to tell you a position on immigration sanctuaries. I just think it's bad that they're the only ones that have really been using this strategy for so many decades. It's obviously pretty effective. I don't think anyone is complaining about immigration sanctuary cities because they don't like the flowery language that's being used in these resolutions or ordinances or laws or policies. I don't think they're just complaining about the text. They don't like it because it has been incredibly impactful on the federal government's ability to do federal immigration enforcement. So it has a serious impact. And so we've been arguing for many, many years now, and really pushing it up in recent years, for states and localities to create sanctuaries for other stuff. Why not for anything and everything? Whether it's Second Amendment, whether it's prohibition, police state, asset forfeiture, pretty much anything where the feds rely heavily on cooperation or support to enforce or implement their so-called laws or regulatory programs. The standard approach to creating a sanctuary for something is to literally stop participating in the enforcement or effectuation of a regulatory program or federal act, federal law, federal executive order, or rule, regulation, whatever it may be. Now, let's say they have some kind of new mandate that comes down from the federal government. We're hearing all kinds of things like that. Well, what if a state or a city or a county decides to say, well, we don't want to participate in that. We're going to ban participation in that from all city or county agencies. And then, therefore, they're creating a sanctuary on that. Now, the reason, again, why this is such a thing is because it's really effective. And here's how the National Governors Association put it in 2013. Let me pull this up on the screen so you can read along as I go. They say states are partners with the federal government in implementing most federal programs. So the unfortunate part is that sanctuaries primarily has only been used for immigration so far. It should be used for pretty much everything. Because if we're looking at the situation that we're living under today, here's my political view. The federal government is the largest government in the history of the planet. It's not even close. And under the constitutional system, that means almost everything that they do on a day-to-day basis, or if you zoom out on a year-to-year or a decade-to-decade basis, shouldn't be done. And the states are helping them all the time. Sometimes they're coerced, or sometimes they're voluntarily bad. I think most of the states suck. Well, all 50 of them are terrible when it comes to the Constitution and liberty, but they can be pushed on one area or another to do a positive thing and say, well, it's popular to opt out of this. And every time they opt out of something maybe you don't agree with, it sets the foundation for your area to opt out of something that you want to see them do it. It just creates this cycle of decentralization. But the states are partners with the federal government on most federal programs. And the dirty little secret that the supporters of the monster state don't want you to know is that partnerships don't work too well when half the team quits. How does that play out? Here is the same message, and this comes from Pew Trust. They did a research report on federalism, fiscal federalism. They say the federal government and the states are partners in almost every major domestic policy area. Together, their dollars pay for healthcare, education, transportation, public safety, and many other programs important to the American public. Of course, they're selling this as a positive. They love all kinds of stuff that isn't authorized by the Constitution over at Pew, but the fact of the matter is we find this gem in their research that they're working together on healthcare. Why not find a way to stop participating in the implementation of federal healthcare programs or federal mandates that may come from something like the CDC, for example? Why participate in these things if that's not something that's in the best interest for the people of your area? Why not work on that? So that really is why it happens. And the only reason why we even hear the term sanctuary is because of this. If they were just passing stuff and it had no impact on anything, whether it's a healthcare sanctuary, which we don't really see, but we should, or immigration or Second Amendment sanctuary, if these localities or states were passing these so-called sanctuary things and they did nothing, there wouldn't be much opposition to it because enforcement would continue the way that supporters of the enforcement want it to continue. So it has a significant impact. Withdrawing support does, and that's why it ends up getting called that. The problem is the federal government is doing too much. If they would stay within their constitutional box, then people who don't want to see a sanctuary on one thing or another might have a little easier time getting the federal government to do what it should be doing or what they want them to do because their resources are stretched so thin. If they're relying on the states to implement everything, from health care to education and transportation and public safety and everything else, then of course it's going to create an environment like this that's going to happen. In fact, Alexander Hamilton, the centralizing pig that he was, he complained about this. I think it was in Federalist 16. He was talking about this and saying, like, look, if a federal act requires cooperation from states to implement, then all states have to do is do nothing and the act is defeated. And he saw that as a problem, but it certainly is a significant part of the constitutional structure. And speaking of that, where does this whole thing come from? We can actually go back to the Declaration of Independence. We should actually go way further back, but this is kind of the culmination of some views, some evolution in the thoughts on sovereignty in American political thought during the Revolutionary period. And here's how Jefferson put it in the Declaration of Independence. Of course, he said, "These united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states." Free and independent states, that has a meaning to it. And Meharry put it this way: free and independent states, not vassals of Washington, D.C., not the subjects of King Biden, and most significantly, not one nation. He said Jefferson went on to write, as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. Now, the term states, it might be confusing to people because we have 50 states, 57, depending who you're talking to, 50 states here in the United States of America. And some people think that these states are basically political subdivisions of one giant country, one blob, one America, when really states had always been seen as free or sovereign, independent, sovereign nations. Now, sovereignty, of course, in the founding generation was understood as being final authority. Final authority through their entire history was always in the hands of one person, a handful of people, some oligarchs, a king, a queen. But they recognized that if people had natural rights bestowed on them by their creator, then there was something that government was a creature of the people. And so therefore, sovereignty really came from the people. The people had that final authority. And that's what free and independent states are. These are representatives of the people. And Jefferson, here's how Mike Meharry put it, and note that Jefferson wrote state, plural, not one state, not one nation. 13 free and independent states. This is extremely significant because it reveals where we find sovereignty in the political system. It resides in the people of the several states. So if the people of each state have final authority over what they do in their state, over what's reserved to them, which is pretty much everything, then they make decisions on how they're going to use their resources. That's kind of the logical connection. And Meharry says this is what we mean when we talk about state sovereignty. Jefferson affirmed it in the Declaration of Independence, and it carried through the ratification of the Constitution. The states never relinquished their sovereignty, and remain to this day free and independent states. Now, they can withdraw from that union if they want, but that's a whole different discussion. It's a voluntary union. Tench Coxe actually reaffirmed exactly what Meharry was talking about. Now, they don't know each other because this was, of course, written at the time of ratification, and he's arguing in support of the Constitution. Here's how Coxe put it. He said, under the new federal Constitution, as an aside, if you don't know who Tench Coxe is, this is one of the best founding era writers on the natural right to keep and bear arms. You certainly should look into him a little bit more. It's Tenchcoxe. He says, under the new federal Constitution, the 13 United States were not intended to be, and really are not consolidated in such manner as to absorb or destroy the sovereignties of the several states, the final authority of the several states. And he goes through all these things that the federal government is not authorized to do. They can't interfere with the opening of rivers and canals, making of regulation of roads, except post roads, because that's something that the people of the states had agreed to delegate to the federal government in the Constitution. Building bridges, ferries, state seminaries, learning, library, blah, 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 etc. He says, nor can they do any other matter or thing appertaining to the internal affairs of any state, whether legislative, executive, or judicial, civil, or ecclesiastical. So really what we're talking about is there is a distinct dividing line. The feds only get to do the stuff that's delegated to them in the Constitution. The rest is out of their hands. The states, as the people determine in each state under their own state constitution, can do whatever they want under their own structure as long as it isn't specifically or expressly prohibited to them in the Constitution. There's a few things in there like on gold and silver and things like that. But what does this mean for how to defend the Constitution? Here's how John Hancock put it on the last day of the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, February 6, 1788. He says, the powers reserved by the people render them secure. So the people have power to protect themselves or do things differently than what the federal government wants them to do. The feds can do certain stuff. Everything else is up to the people of the states. And this is how James Madison put it just maybe a week or so earlier. So Hancock was February 6, 1788. This was, I think, on January 29th. I'm assuming that Hancock was probably not reading Federalist number 46, which was published just in New York only a week later. It's possible. He was a rich guy, so he had access to a lot of stuff. He was very well read. He knew what was going on. But I don't think he was picking up a very specific take from Madison, whom he probably didn't even know was writing Federalist at the time, was under Publius. Here's how Madison said that the people and the states should deal with federal programs, whether they were what he called warrantable or unwarrantable. Now, to Madison, warrantable meant it was authorized under the Constitution, or unwarrantable is not authorized. So something could be authorized under the Constitution, but the people still think it's bad policy. Now, the solution, a lot of people think, is just to vote the bums out, or just, we got to wait for the next team. We got to wait for 4 years later before we can change this policy. And generally what happens, that means 400 years or 40 years. And those policies really never, once they're in, they never change if you rely on the federal government to change them. And specifically in Federalist 46, and I've covered this in much more detail elsewhere, I will link to this article, which does go over it in more detail as well. Madison did not include things like vote the bums out if you want to change federal policy or sue in federal court. He advised a series of 4 steps for individuals and states. He says this is the disquietude of the people, their repugnance and perhaps refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union, actively resist with officers of the Union on policies they don't like that are authorized under the Constitution or stuff that they see has never been delegated to them under the Constitution. He says, refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. He says, were the sentiments of several adjoining states happen to be in union, would present obstructions which the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. So even at a time when the federal government was intended to be so small, it would be totally unrecognizable to anything we have today. I mean, the federal government today tells us what size our toilet has to be, what kind of light bulbs we can have or not have, what kind of plants we can grow in our backyard, whether or not and how we can defend our home, our family, our property, and the like. They have control over anything and everything. They control how the size of street signs. expanding the notion of post roads beyond just those that had posts as mile markers, really, for the founders. So like the interstate highway system, to control over every single road in the country. They never had that authority. But Madison recognized that even at a time when the government was going to be very small, if the states weren't on board, if the people didn't help the feds, if the people actually resisted, the federal government would have had an incredibly hard time implementing anything. And if you put that in, if you tie that in with the fact that states are partners on most federal programs today, it's even way more effective now. It becomes so simple to undermine, nullify, and defeat a federal program. It's literally just saying, nah, we're going to do nothing. Just like Alexander Hamilton didn't want to see, states can literally do nothing, don't participate, and a federal government that relies on those states to implement the program can't get it done because they don't have the person power or the resources to pull that off. Now, one last thing I want to talk about very briefly is some of the kind of legal or court basis behind this. And this is something called the Anti-Commandeering Doctrine. I know those of you who listen to or watch this show on a regular basis, you've heard all of these things in various pieces many times over the last few years. But here's a quick overview of anti-commandeering from an article we published by Mike Meharry. He says, James Madison's advice for resisting federal overreach in Federalist 46 serves as the basis for what we now know as the legal doctrine of anti-commandeering. Madison advised 4 primary tactics for individuals and states to effectively push back against federal overreach, including a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. There are now 5 landmark cases where the Supreme Court... If you know me, you know I am never going to say something is constitutional or not because the Supreme Court said so. And if you know me, I'm not going to say ever something is right or wrong because the Supreme Court says so. I will cite the Supreme Court once in a while, and it's not very often, but when they actually back up the constitutional structure, when they back up the founders. And they have done this repeatedly from 1842 all the way to 2018 in a series of 5 landmark cases. I'll highlight 2 here. The first one that kicked it off was a case called Preg versus Pennsylvania. This is where Justice Joseph Story held that the federal government could not force states to implement or carry out the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. There were 2 of them, 1793 and 1850. He said that it was a federal law. He wasn't striking down the Fugitive Slave Act. He was just saying this is a federal law, and if it's a federal priority, because there's this divided federalism, this divided sovereignty, however they're going to put it, he said it's a federal government, then it's the federal government's job to do that. That's their job. They can't compel states or localities to help them out. He says the states there cannot, therefore, be compelled to enforce them, and it might well be deemed an unconstitutional exercise of the power of interpretation to insist that the states are bound to provide means to carry into effect the duties of the national government. It's nowhere delegated in the Constitution where states are required to participate in the enforcement of federal stuff. I mean, are states required to help effectuate and run the post office? Absolutely not. When they declare war, are states required to participate in that? No. I mean, there's a guard situation. There's so many powers that have been delegated to the federal government. There's about 30 to 35, depending on how you count them. And it's now resulted in, if you think of how this would play out if the states were compelled, and it's basically how it plays out today, but they aren't required to do this, like environmental regulations, healthcare regulations, insurance regulations, regulations over light bulbs and toilets, whatever it may be, financial control. All these things the states are voluntarily participating. Oftentimes the feds just steal money from the people through taxation. Then they go to the states and they say, well, you politicians like having a lot of power and you want as much as possible, so here's a bunch of funding so you can do stuff and look good to your people. And so then they throw some money back, but it gets filtered. It's not as much as what they took. They're paying off a bunch of people in the interim. And then the states do the stuff that the federal government shouldn't be doing in the first place, even some of the stuff that they should be doing. They're just so overextended that they're relying on the states for everything. That's the first case, Preg versus Pennsylvania. The most recent one, and of course I will link to this overview of these 5 cases in the show notes. The most recent one was 2018, a case called Murphy versus NCAA. This is a sports betting case from New Jersey. And here Meharry writes, the court held that Congress can't take any action that, quote, dictates what a state legislature may and may not do, even when the state action conflicts with federal law. So if a state decides to do something that is opposite of federal law, in this situation, the feds were saying that sports gambling was illegal, and New Jersey was saying, well, we're going to have sports gambling. And so the federal government at that time was suing. They're basically saying, well, you can't do this. Or there was a lawsuit. I'm not sure who initiated this lawsuit, but they're basically saying you're not authorized to do this. You can't do it. Federal law says you can't do this. But again, the Supreme Court upheld this Madisonian principle, a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union through the Anti-Commandeering Doctrine, saying that it cannot dictate what a state legislature may and may not do. Samuel Alito put it this way: a more direct affront to state sovereignty is not easy to imagine. I'll wrap it up with this quote from that case as well. The Anti-Commandeering Doctrine may sound arcane, he wrote, but is simply the expression of a fundamental structural decision incorporated into the Constitution. That is, the decision to withhold from Congress the power to issue orders directly to the states. You're not a sovereign state if the union that you've created through a voluntary compact or an agreement, that union, the new entity, can then dictate to the creators. The creature is dictating to the creators what they can and cannot do. This totally defies the entire structure, the principles of the revolution, the notion of sovereignty, the notion of delegated and reserved powers. The federal government, now, if they want to help out, or if you think it's a politically good thing to do, they certainly can, and they certainly do all the time. And I think that is it's kind of a dark cloud showing how much people love centralized control in this country, because they want the states to continue doing everything on healthcare, on immigration, on gun rights, on speech, on everything. They just want the states they want everything to be uniform across the entire country. And that is the antithesis of what these 13 free and independent states had created right off the bat. Anyways, at the end of the day, when you think about this, a state, a county, a city qualifies as a sanctuary. It could be a sanctuary state, a sanctuary city, when they've actively banned participation in the enforcement or implementation of some federal act, some federal regulatory, some federal order, whatever it may be. Those that don't do that are not sanctuaries, whatever they claim to be. A lot of them pass things, resolutions that aren't even binding law, that ban nothing, that claim that they're creating a sanctuary for something. If they have not banned participation, they are not a sanctuary. They're just grandstanding. Now, this can be, of course, for any federal act or program. Sometimes it's very narrow, sometimes it's really broad, sometimes it's somewhere in between. The concept goes back to the structure of the Constitution, to the Revolution, to the Declaration of Independence. The strategy was outlined by James Madison. Surprisingly, we've seen the Supreme Court reaffirm this over and over and over for well over 150 years. And so now, hopefully, with this information, whether you support or oppose any particular sanctuary proposal, sanctuary effort, that's not really the goal here. I just want you to have the tools that you need to look at something. When you hear some politicians say, we're creating a sanctuary for blank, for the Second Amendment, for healthcare, for immigration. A lot of politicians will say things like that, and then you can actually go look and see what they've passed, what they've done. Sometimes they're just declaring it. If they've just declared it, they're certainly lying to you. If they've passed something that has no prohibition, they're lying to you. If they've passed something that seems to have a prohibition, it gets a little tricky. Sometimes they create so many loopholes that there really isn't a ban, and they'll continue doing the enforcement over and over anyways. So you should be able to at least have some basic tools to, anytime you hear some politician talk about this, be able to look at what's really going on behind the scenes and know which ones are telling the truth, which is very, very few, which ones are grandstanding and lying. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational more than anything. I hope you learned something. It's not an easy topic, and it has a lot of political ramifications. A lot of people really don't like hearing about things. that maybe they don't support on one issue or another. So what we find, and maybe I'll do an episode on this in the future if you're interested, what we find are those who support sanctuaries, they make a lot of legal arguments in support of them. They only do that when it comes to an issue that they support. But as soon as it's used on an issue that they oppose, they come up with all kinds of twisted legal arguments, twisted constitutional arguments sometimes, but very, very poor ones, to try to make the kind of have it both ways. Like, it's okay to do this when I like it, and it's not okay when I don't. They're confusing the word constitutional with the word good, and the word unconstitutional with the phrase stuff I don't like. I will look in the live chat, since I'm going a little over today. I've got some stuff to do today. I will look in the live chat and in the comments in the archives a little bit later today and see if I can answer any questions. Of course, if you support the show, you like what we're doing, and if you've got a few bucks a month to spare to help us out to continue doing this work in support of the Constitution and liberty, our membership program starts out as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I'm going to link to all the stuff I talked about, the arguments in support and against, the definitions, the legal doctrine, the Madison, Tench Cox, all that stuff. I will link to that in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And of course, if you can't, or if you can, support us as a member, there are other things that you can do that are free and super easy to help us spread the word. Most of the mainstream platforms have pretty easily triggered algorithms. So if you do stuff like smashing a like button, leaving a comment, a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, subscribing, getting notifications, clicking that bell on YouTube and elsewhere, when you do that stuff, it triggers that algorithm that tells the platform to show the program to more people, and I can't thank you enough for helping us spread the word. Anyways, I will look through the chat a little bit later today, see if I can answer some questions. You can also email me at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. It's all spelled out. I really appreciate you being here. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.